And indeed, beginning with the first observations of abrupt depletions of ionization in the topside ionosphere by Muldrew, many attempts have been made to link the electron density trough and later the light ion trough with the similarly abrupt depletions in the thermal proton distribution in the outer plasmasphere. Such studies have met with varied success, owing in part to the complexity of the relationship between the dominant topside ions O+ and H+, which depend upon local time and season, and their variations will result in local light ion trough distributions which may either coexist with total density troughs or may be hidden below relatively non-descriptive distributions of the major ions O+. In addition to these complications, we have more recent observations which indicate that the light ion trough itself may be made up of multiple troughs. An example of this type of result is given in this slide that's being viewed now. These topside profiles of O+ and H+ were obtained at equinox near dawn local time. And you'll see in the light ion distribution, the H+ density, a typical trough-like decrease at latitudes of 50, 60 degrees in both hemispheres. Whereas on this pass, the O+ density in going through the light ion trough increases with latitude, so that the resultant total density or electron density trough is really not as pronounced as the light ion trough. Also, you'll notice the structure on a low latitude portion of the light ion trough. It's seen in both hemispheres, and in total density, it's there, but if we did not have the light ion measurements, we would not pick this out as a singular structure. Now, these subtroughs on the low latitude side of the light ion troughs have been found to be a rather characteristic feature of the light ion trough. It is not an exceptional case. And these probably bear a strong resemblance to certain of the structured proton distributions which have been observed in the equatorial plane by the ion spectrometers on OGO 3 and OGO 5. And an example comparing this structure on the low latitude side of the trough with the equatorial structure is shown in the next slide, in which we have plotted OGO 5 and OGO 4 measurements on the same scales. And you will notice in the OGO 5 measurements there are structural features associated with the plasmapause transition which are quite similar to the observations in a light ion trough. Now, these were not obtained at the same time, so they are not the identical structures, but they're just made to show that the features do appear to represent a field-aligned structure rather than a localized ionospheric structure. Such structure is similar to the detached plasma regions which have been studied by Chappell and which could correspond to plasma stripped from the plasmasphere by time-dependent convection variations. In addition to these features, which we associate with thermoplasma convection processes, there also appears to be a rather persistent high-latitude trough which further complicates studies of trough-plasmapause coupling. This irregularity, which we are going to refer to as the high-latitude trough in contrast to the light ion trough, was relatively difficult to identify originally, owing to the fact that this feature was commonly associated with auroral activity, which exhibits considerable variation from orbit to orbit of OGO 4 or OGO 6 to polar orbiting satellites. However, recent studies of the high-latitude measurements, aided by the processing of molecular ion data for the same region, have yielded molecular atom-ion relationships which appear to clearly identify a trough in addition to the light ion trough, a trough which appears to be unrelated to the plasmapause. An example of this is shown in the next slide, which shows profiles of O+, H+, and the molecular ion NO+ on the bottom on an apogee pass of OGO 6 near dusk local time at equinox. If you look first at the H+ profile, you see the evidence of the light ion trough. The decrease from the equator, reaching a plateau for about 10 degrees. We believe that this point is associated with a plasmapause type of trough. But superimposed on this trough is a high latitude depletion, which occurs typically above 70 degrees geomagnetic latitude. And you will note the same depletion mechanism occurring in both hemispheres. Comparing the H plus with the O plus distribution, the O plus shows a significant decrease in the same location in both hemispheres also. This is in contrast to the light ion trough shown previously, where the O plus tended to increase in the light ion trough region. Now, it is this one-to-one anti-correlation between the molecular ion enhancements and atomic ion depletion which we think helps to clarify the problem as to whether this trough is or is not associated with the plasmapause. The possible confusion which such structures can produce in ionospheric magnetospheric coupling study is again suggested in the next slide, in which pre-Dawn and post-Dawn sets of O plus and H plus distributions are illustrated. Before dawn, the light ion trough is seen with this structural feature, which we associate with an equatorial magnetospheric phenomena. The O plus density on this pass was increasing, so that in the total electron density profile, the trough is not as pronounced as in the light ion distribution. In the after dawn profile, the H plus density is a minor ion throughout most of the orbit, and the structural feature which we associate with an equatorial convection origin is really not seen in the total density profile. But as we go to higher latitudes where there's a trough in total electron density, you'll also see a trough forming in O plus in conjunction with the H plus. And the NO plus measurements for this again show a peak in the NO plus at the same location. From this in a previous slide, it is apparent that the diurnal variations which we encounter in the topside ionosphere measurements do complicate the interpretation of electron density profiles, and that this high latitude trough, which is always seen at latitudes and L positions well above the expected L position of the plasmapause, may also serve to confuse these studies. Multiple electron density troughs at mid and high latitudes are in themselves not really a new result. They have been observed before extensively by Muldrew and more recently by a number of independent workers. This complication, for example, might explain the observation by Muldrew that the location of the main trough, quotes, on the day side is at higher latitudes than the expected plasmapause signature. Now, the fact that the thermal particle distributions appear to be strongly related to the magnetic field configuration presents still a further complication to sorting out these troughs set on the topside ionosphere. Since the profiles obtained for satellites are constantly changing with respect to orientation relative to magnetic field, we can expect a wide variation in the shapes and positions of the trough features observed as the orbit intersects field lines from different directions. Examinations of several sets of OGO-6 ion composition measurements indicates rather predictable patterns in the relationships between the troughs do occur, perhaps the most evident being that in which the light ion trough and the high latitude trough, which I'm discussing now, tend to converge in latitude as the magnetic field system wobbles beneath the relatively fixed orbit of the satellite during one day's Earth rotation. This pattern is, of course, complicated by short-term changes associated by changing magnetic activity, but on a statistical sense, we seem to see this behavior over and over again. The last slide shows this by giving 3 consecutive southern hemisphere passes of OGO-6. The sequence is from right to left in time, near 2100 local time. Now, these observations were selected from a longitude range which spanned the meridian containing the north magnetic pole. And we did this so that a distinct orientation change between the satellite path and field line orientation would occur between each of the passes. By comparison of the H plus profiles, you will note what we call light ion trough is originally distinct from the high latitude trough. But with each subsequent orbit, the light ion trough tends to merge towards the high latitude trough, so that eventually on the last orbit it's rather indistinct as to whether there is a separation between the two troughs or not. And the situation is even more complex in the electron density, where originally you saw the mid-latitude trough possibly, the high-latitude trough appears, and eventually you lose both of them, so that in the final result you're just looking at the high-latitude trough rather than the light ion trough, which would be associated with the plasmapause. A further piece of evidence which is contained in this slide is on the bottom, and this, we think, supports the view that the high-latitude trough is perhaps related by but observationally separate phenomena from the plasmapause. And this is the simultaneous broadband noise response recorded simultaneously by the Dartmouth VLF experiment on OGO 6. In particular, note the poleward peaks of the noise, which seem to correlate one-to-one with the NO plus peaks, which correlate with the H plus depletions. Now, on a statistical basis, the same type of broadband VLF noise has been previously associated with the auroral zone and correlated directly with soft electron precipitation. Although simultaneous precipitating particle data has not yet been identified for the high latitude molecular peak events which I am showing, this indirect evidence provided by the VLF activity, as well as the abruptness and latitudinal position of the events far poleward of the plasmapause, strongly suggests that the high latitude trough phenomena is associated with disturbances of the lower atmosphere-ionosphere produced by particle precipitation in the magnetospheric cusp auroral zone. That is, it's a phenomenon that occurs locally. It is not a phenomenon which we would see aligned along the field line in the equatorial plane. Now, the high latitude ionization decrease, which I've shown here only in O plus and H plus, also exists in the Ne plus and N plus, so it is a total density depletion. It could be consistent with a particle precipitation measurement since several chemical reactions are available in the lower ionosphere, which when stimulated might lead to strong enhancements in the molecular components, coupled with significant decreases in the atomic components. Most notably, the vibrationally excited reaction between N2 and O plus would appear to provide a good possibility for such a response. So that in summary, evidence is growing that multiple troughs do exist in both the light ion and electron density profiles, troughs which are produced probably by distinctly different physical mechanisms, and hence care must be exercised in coupling studies to relate the troughs to their proper origin. Thank you.
Yes, question, Jan. Wait, you wait for the microphone.
Yes, what is the VLF frequency range? I can't read it from back here.
Well,
Nor can anyone now.
I just received this slide about 3 days ago, so I'm not sure myself.
Thank you.
20 to 1 megahertz, okay.
Peter Banks. I think the observations of these little bumps and wiggles on the sides of the fall off in the proton distribution are interesting. But on the other hand, your altitude range of the satellite always falls between, say, 1,000 or 1,100 kilometers down to 600 kilometers. And that's just the region where the proton density is rising to a peak and then typically falling back. And it's not clear to me just how important these bumps and wiggles are until you deconvolve that sort of variation as you climb up in latitude and altitude, or vice versa. And so some of these bumps and wiggles may be de-emphasized, and in fact maybe just a function of passing through this peak proton density, which is from 600 to 800 kilometers. And it would seem to me that you have to go back and do a little more dynamics before you can point out or attach a particular significance to some of these light ion features.
I agree with this. The high latitude trough, I think we are getting some experimental evidence which indicates that it may not be related to the plasmapause. As far as the light ion trough, the mid-latitude trough, which I have been speaking about, I guess it's still not known whether this would be related directly to the plasmapause with the sloping and then the dropping off. This may be an altitude effect. And what we really need are simultaneous measurements along the field line, an equatorial satellite versus a near-Earth satellite to resolve the problem. I agree.
Joe, is it your feeling that the plasma tail idea, or at least the bumps that seem to occur on the low latitude side, equatorial side of the light ion trough, are more nearly associated with the deep variations and dips that we see inside what we would call the plasmasphere in the equatorial plane, as opposed to what I've referred to as detached plasma type regions, which seem to occur generally at much higher L shells, and which might tend to be lost, for example, in auroral precipitation variations at low altitudes? What's your current feeling on what the tail, as it shows up in the ionosphere and the topside, is related to?
Well, I think it's related more to your low L depressions that you did see that I think you originally called a ripple event, this type of behavior within L equals 5. But we have difficulties in looking at your detached regions in the trough because I think auroral ionization tends to come in the same region. We would lose your detached regions near the Earth.
Right.
But your innermost depressions we think we would see as the structures I've shown.
One more time.
As kind of a novice in this field, what have you done anything that relates to your equatorial OGO 3 and OGO 5 positions of the plasmapause
Well,
tube
if you
for
wait,
light
the
ion trough?
paper I was going to present next that Chen's going to present really discusses this. In fact, I should say the fine structure we had on the OGO 4 data for the April, I think it was the first slide I showed on the low latitude side of light ion trough, we did do a model calculation using the model that will be discussed in the next paper. And we find, although this was at dawn, we predict in our model a plasma tail base would just be hitting dawn at the time OGO 4 crossed dawn.
Oh,
So
the
from
reason,
the model
reason
study, it appears to be explainable.
I say the reason for the question, if you just take all of the stuff I think you've published on where the light ion trough is, it seems to usually be at a lower altitude, or L value, if you like, than kind of the average position that people get at the equatorial plane.
Well, you should be careful about that. In light ion measurements, typically we sometimes don't see a trough at dusk. And this is where in the equatorial plane they get the largest L positions for plasmapause. And in many of the trough studies, they really don't give adequate statistics near dusk where you would expect these high L values. So on a global scale, your average L coordinate would be smaller than you would expect in the equatorial plane.
I think we'll move on to that other paper he referred to.